Hello watch lovers, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have a really cool and historically important watch on the bench. This is a Hamilton chrono-matic from the early 1970s, and perhaps it was the first automatic chronograph. We do see it has a couple of issues. The second hand doesn't really reset properly, it flicks a little bit back and forth. And the owner also told me that after 19 minutes of running the chronograph it stops. So there is something going on there. The bezel should be possible to turn, but it's very, very tight. The date seems to work all right. Quick set as well. And the dial is this lovely blue color. Vertical brushing. See, the case has had a little bit over polishing along the edges there. Case back, a little bit worn, but in general the watch looks very nice. Of course the bezel insert is a bit worn as well. If we look at the timekeeping, the watch actually keeps pretty good time, but very low amplitude. And the owner also told me that it's been a long time since it's been serviced, so we'll see what we find. And what we find inside the watch is the caliber 11, and that is the original chrono-matic movement. Now, before we go into the history of that, just want to warn everyone, do not respond to anyone in the comment field asking you to contact them on Telegram. They are scammers, so do not fall for them. Consider yourself warned. So I'm spending a little bit time trying to figure out how this movement works. It is a modular construction, so the chronograph part is built on top of an existing automatic movement. On the left side of the movement we have the minute counter, and on the right side we have the hour counter. And the way the hour counter works on a chronomatic movement is a bit different. It actually counts every half hour. And the reason for that is that this is a module on top of an existing movement. Typically an hour counting chronograph would take the hour counting from the barrel directly. But if we speed up a little bit, we'll see the first intermediate hour counting wheel has a little finger on top of it that flicks over the intermediate hour counting wheel, and thereby also the hour counting wheel. And if we turn the watch around, we can see that the hour counter has gone half an hour forward. It's an interesting way of doing it. Also, there is no running seconds hand on this watch. Again, because it is a bit complicated to make that when you're putting a module on top of an existing movement. Now let's take the case screws out and get the movement out of the case. And there we go. It's a beautiful dial, very good condition. There is, however, a problem with the hands. Oh, f*** me. So when I come across chronographs where the chronograph hand is stuck like that, I use a cutting tweezer to take it off. But we see even the hour counting hand is completely stuck. So we're left with two hands that came off their tube. And that obviously feels really bad when it happens. For old watches, it's also pretty much impossible to find the replacement hands. It is not impossible to fix it, so we'll manage to do that. But here we can see the tube still left on the pivots there. That little red top from the hands. So I mentioned in the teaser post for this video that we might start a flame war for who came up with the first automatic chronograph. And you might have seen the video I did on the El Primero a little while back. And the El Primero, of course, means first in Spanish for some odd reason. But was it really the first automatic chronograph? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Well, thanks, Bob, but that's not really it. The answer is that it depends. Imagine a bunch of kids running towards a candy box. And the one that's in the middle of the pack yells first. Does that make the kid first? Because that's essentially what Zenith did. They announced early in January 1969 that they were making an automatic chronograph. And they had a single prototype to show. And the reason they announced it, and it was also a pretty small, low-key event that didn't get a lot of publicity, but the reason they announced it was because they heard that there was a consortium planning to release the first automatic chronograph just a couple of months later on the Basel Fair. So Zenith was probably like, aha! Let's announce it first and then we'll see when we can produce it. But the fact was that this consortium, driven by Hoyer and Breitling, had actually been working on an automatic chronograph for quite a while, which of course Zenith also had. And at the time of Zenith's announcement, the consortium already had some 100 prototypes ready. So they were in fact far ahead of Zenith. They just didn't announce as early as Zenith. So the consortium announced their automatic chronograph in March 1969, so a couple of months after Zenith. But they did so with great fanfare. They had simultaneous press briefings pretty much across the world. Tokyo, Hong Kong, New York, Geneva, of course. And the Geneva one was even hosted by the chairman of the Fédération Horlogère, so the Federation for Watchmaking in Switzerland. And they had those 100 prototypes that they showed off to the press. And apparently even some members of the press were able to go home with some of the prototypes. Whoa, that's an oil spill right there. Someone tried to solve a problem by pouring oil on, which doesn't really work. So this chrono-matic consortium, the project was called Project 99. I'll put in a link in the description with a really good article about it. The main partners were Breitling and Hoyer. Hoyer had started the whole thing together with Buren. Buren was the maker of the automatic movement, which we now pretty much can see on screen. You can see it has a micro rotor, which made for a very thin movement. That's why they chose this movement. Of course, Buren was actually bought by Hamilton sort of midway through this project, so in 1966. But Hamilton wasn't really a driving force behind it. Buren was more or less independent within Hamilton still. And they then produced the automatic movements with a few small modifications to allow the module to work on top. Breitling was brought in mainly to help finance the project. And there is one last partner, which I haven't mentioned yet, and that is Dubois-Desprats. You might recognize that name from a very common module nowadays, used in a lot of chronographs from a lot of different brands. I did service an Omega Speedmaster Reduced Schumacher edition on the channel with the modern Dubois-Desprats movement, so you can have a look at that also. Coming back to the discussion about who made the first automatic chronograph, it is certainly a fact that Zenith was actually the last one to bring the watches to market. That happened towards the end of 1969. Whereas the consortium, or the chrono-matic versions, they had watches ready for full production in quite early 1969, and were thus selling watches already at a pretty good clip. Of course, the third competitor was Seiko. And Seiko also announced their automatic chronograph at the Basel Fair. Not with a lot of fanfare. They were, from what I understand, very focused on the quartz movement. Or perhaps they expected the mechanical watch to fall by the wayside in the near future. I will, of course, also feature Seiko 6139 on the channel in not so long, so keep an eye out for that. Coming back to this movement, we see that the train doesn't run all that smoothly, and the chronograph driving wheel on top of the bridge there seems to be a bit wobbly. Now this is actually caused by the pivot being bent, and that has likely happened when someone either put the chronograph driving wheel back on or took it off. And it's pretty certainly also what causes a chronograph to stop at 19 minutes, because then the angle becomes too steep and the wheels bind. So we're going to have to try to straighten that pivot, which is a challenge in itself, but it's also a challenge finding spare parts for this movement. By the way, speaking of the consortium, sort of sounds a little bit shady, you know? Like, hey Tony, that's a good automatic chronograph you got there, huh? Would be a shame if anything happened to it. Maybe not quite Sopranos, but I do sort of envision some backroom dealing with some cigars and whiskeys. And anyway, to round it off, it's also a fact that Zenith is the only one who still produces the movement they introduced. The El Primero is, of course, still in production and going very strongly. It was quite ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And of course, also an integrated chronograph, which makes more sense as well when you're thinking that the El Primero was developed by one company. We've gotten down to the keyless works. Part of the reason that this movement has a low profile, just a little bit more than 3 millimeters, and part of the reason it is that thin is because it's also indirectly driven, so no cannon pinion from the center wheel. So can we conclude anything then about who made the first automatic chronograph? Well, not really. Because Zenith announced it first. The consortium showed it in mass production first. And Seiko sold it first. So yeah, it was a great year for watch enthusiasts, 1969. Of course, also the year that the first quartz watch, the Seiko Astron, was introduced. So a big year in watch circles. We're just cleaning off the pivots on the wheels a little bit. And then we're going to take the mainspring out of the barrel, and then we get ready for the cleaning machine. All right, with that done, we have all the parts laid out. Quite a few parts in this movement. So let's get them cleaned. While the machine is doing a lovely job for us, we're going to turn to the case. As noted, the bezel insert is quite worn, but that's common when you have a metal insert that is painted like that. We are going to touch up the case, but we're not going to do a lot to it. The first thing we need to do is take out the pushers and the crown. These are the common type pushers that you simply screw in from the inside. So the case doesn't look all that dirty so far, but wait. This is just child's play, man. Just to give it a minute and we'll find all the dirt you ever wanted to see, or not. To take the bezel off, we use this tool that squeezes between the case and the bezel. This is a Chinese version of a more expensive tool. Works really well. And let's get a close-up then of the dirt. Oh, I think I puked a little bit in my mouth. That is dirty. That's a few decades worth of skin cells, hair, dust. For the bezel insert, it's just a snap in into the bezel. So we can gently pry it out with a plastic probe. And look at... Oh, that is gross, man. And we're not done yet. Now, this is a good reason both for using tissue paper and for not eating before you work on old watches. Oh, no more now, please. Oh. Oh, water. Oh. Oh, please, no more. Oh, look. Hey, I gotta go out for a second, man. Seriously. Is it finished? Okay, thank God. Thankfully, that's the worst I've ever seen in a watch. Well, I don't mean thankfully for seeing that. Thankfully that I haven't seen anything worse yet. So last thing before we can clean the case is to take the tube for the crown out. So we have a tool for that as well. And with that we can clean the case in the ultrasonic. So quick question, do you like the sound of nails scratching against the blackboard? If you do, you're going to love this sound. Ooh. All right, we got the movement back from the cleaning machine. So the first thing we're going to do is assemble the barrel. So the barrel is where the mainspring sits. And the mainspring is the only source of power in a mechanical watch. Most watches nowadays are automatic watches. That means that there is self-winding, but not all by itself, of course, because it needs to get energy from somewhere. And that somewhere is from the movements of the wrist of the person who wears the watch. So every time you rotate your wrist a little bit, that rotor that we saw will move a little bit, rotate a little bit, and then wind the watch a tiny little bit. Most automatic watches can also be hand wound. And it's a good habit to give the watch a few revolutions of the crown if you haven't worn it for a while and it's stopped by itself. But there are also a few watches that cannot be hand wound at all. As, for example, the Seiko 6139. So the automatic chronograph Seiko introduced. And also I did a movement about the Seiko Bell-matic a little while ago, and that watch also cannot be hand wound. So after we got the mainspring back into the barrel, we put the lid back on and then we press the lid tightly shut. Snap! And every time we rotate that arbor in the center of the mainspring there, we coil the mainspring up and thus store power. But that power gets eaten up very fast if there's a lot of friction in the train. And the friction is avoided in two ways, with very smooth surfaces, so highly polished, and then also lubrication. And in some parts that lubrication may creep, so it might try to escape basically. So to avoid that, we use this thing called fix or drop that you see here, which leaves a very thin film on the surface and thus allows lubrication to stay in place. After soaking these parts, not the pallet fork, but the others, we also clean the pivots a little bit of the escape wheel and the pallet fork, just to make sure, in some pithwood. And then we can oil the capstones. These capstones are synthetic rubies, so they're extremely hard, some of the hardest material on Earth. And that hardness, combined with being very smooth and then a tiny little bit of oil, makes the pivots on the balance wheel rotate or oscillate very smoothly, with very little friction. Those little golden springs on top there that we close on top of the jewel are to help against shocks. So if your watch drops on the floor or you hit your wrist against the door jamb, then that will flex ever so slightly and thus avoid any damage. So let's see now then if the balance oscillates nicely. Yeah, that looks fine. Now that bent pivot on the fourth wheel that made the chronograph driving will wobble. We have to deal with that. These pivots are made of steel that is then hardened, so trying to bend it without first heating it up would break it clean off. So what I'm doing is using a steel tweezer that holds the pivot, and then I'm heating that steel tweezer. You see it's getting red there. So the tweezer then transfers the heat to the pivot, and thus makes the pivot a little bit softer, a little bit more malleable. And it's a great way to burn your fingers. As you might have noticed, the pivot was bent halfway from the wheel, so not at the base of the wheel. And that means that we can use a flat pair of tweezers to try to bend it straight. And then I'm trying it with the lathe to see if it's running straight afterwards. So after a couple of iterations, it runs true enough. And then I need to polish the pivot a little bit, because the tweezer will have left a few marks. Now this pivot doesn't run inside a jewel hole, so it's not as important that it's super polished. But a little bit we're gonna do. And then when testing the pivot in the train, we see it's much better. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. Now the base movement I mentioned is Buren caliber. It's the 1281. And it is a little bit different also from most standard movements, in that some of the bearings are actually on the dial side. So we have to put that on first before we start on the train side. Now there are many ways to skin a cat. Sorry, I have 2 cats, I keep forgetting it. There are many ways to approach the rebuild of the movement. I like to just put the barrel in first and then build the train and wheels. Some people like to do it the other way around. And some really weird people also like to start with the keyless works. Oh, it's not that weird, but what can you say? Watchmakers are a special breed anyway. So I was asked the other day what I think about the future of mechanical watches, and I did discuss that in a couple of videos before. But to me there are 2 main factors that I think mechanical wristwatches have a nice future. The first of those 2 is that we are, as humans, just fascinated with wheels and cogs moving. It's just something very fulfilling to us, I think, when you move one wheel, and a lot of other wheels and cogs or pinions move as well. And I think a great proof point for that is that most watches, or maybe not most, but a lot of watches nowadays have display backs, so that you can see the movement and see those wheels move back and forth, and the balance wheel oscillate and so forth. The second factor is that technologically, mechanical wristwatches are obsolete. And they've been obsolete pretty much since 1969, when Seiko introduced the Astron, the quartz watch. But at least since the 80s, when quartz watches really took over. And it might sound like a negative factor that the technology is obsolete. But what it has resulted in is watches, mechanical watches, becoming luxury items. And luxury items are basically useless. They have no real purpose. They just fulfill our desire for shiny things and for getting jealousy and acceptance from others. But with watches being luxury items the way they are, they kind of also secure their own future. Because when people are willing to pay a lot of money for a luxury item to feel status, or to maybe reward themselves, feel good, that kind of thing, then you have a big market. And that is disposable money. And that is a completely different market than the commodity market, where you basically have to have something and it's a race to the bottom in terms of pricing. So yeah. I think mechanical wristwatches have a good future. And for those interested in tinkering with watches, of course, like probably most people watching this video right now are, I am planning to do a sort of review of the British Horological Institute's distance learning course, which is a fantastic offering in my view, but I'll get back to that in a few weeks. But the reason I want to review that is, of course, since I did it myself. That's how I got started. I used to work in corporate roles as well, part of the rat race. And I must say it's much more fulfilling to make a watch work than it is to create an Excel spreadsheet and a few PowerPoint slides that no one really pays attention to anyway. All right, we got the keyless works back together. We're just going to make sure we lubricate the friction points. In the keyless works, there's quite a lot of heavy friction when we pull the crown in and out like that. So then we use pretty solid grease. But for most of the rest of the watch, we use thinner oils. And yes, those oils and greases are specifically formulated for wristwatches. It wouldn't really help you much to use motor oil for a wristwatch. With the pallet fork in, we can lubricate it. What we do is to put a little bit of grease or lubrication on the exit pallet stone in the center of the image here. And then we rock the pallet fork back and forth so that that oil or grease slides off onto the escape wheel teeth, which are the teeth on the wheel on the left side here. All right. Then we can put the balance in and get ready for the moment of truth. Will it blend? No, that's a different video. Yeah, we see it started up nicely. Not a lot of power on the mainspring, so we're going to wind it a little bit more before we oil the pivots and check the watch on the time grapher. The time grapher basically gives us a snapshot of how the watch is running right here and now. And what we want to see are straight lines. It's going to be one line for the ticks and one for the talks. And we want to see them close to each other like here. This looks pretty good. The amplitude is a little bit high here, simply because I used the wrong lift angle. And the watch ran 8 seconds plus per day. But that's fine, it runs a little bit slower in the other position, so we're going to give it a little bit extra there. Now the automatic works on this watch is also a little bit strange. We see this wheel here is actually the one that keeps the automatic works from running backwards. And it does that with those 3 little arms on top of the wheel there. But it also makes the winding a little bit strange. It feels very grainy. Because every time you wind with a crown, you also wind that wheel. So that's a bit odd as well. So as mentioned, this is a micro rotor movement. And another company that's famous for micro rotor movements is of course Universal Genève. And there were some patent disputes between those two companies, and Universal Genève actually had to pay Buren a fee for every time they built a watch with the micro rotor movement, because Buren had the patent for it. Works relatively similar, except that for on this movement you have this floating reverser wheel that simply lies between 2 large jewels, the one you see here and the one on the other side. So we gave that a little drop of oil. and then it should run okay. We press the chronograph driving wheel back in place, and we should be able to see that it runs much truer now. And with that, we can put the chronograph plate on. Now, I said a couple of times that this is a modular approach, so modular movement. And these 3 blued screws that I'm putting in here are the ones that attach the chronograph module to the base movement. And with all the chronograph parts assembled, you can even take the entire chronograph module off just by unscrewing those 3 blued screws. So if there's a problem with the base movement, you don't have to disassemble all the parts for the chronograph. That's one of the beauties of modular movement, of course. And one of the things Dubois-Deprat had to do when they made this module was to be quite creative in terms of how the different parts work together. So there are a few kind of strange springs and levers. They of course all make sense once you've put everything together right. But for the eagle-eyed observer, I am making a mistake that I will correct a little bit later on. But let me know in the comment field if you see my mistake. I haven't quite made it yet. So there's a clue for you. So as mentioned, these movements are not made anymore. But the watches with them inside are quite valuable nowadays. This watch would probably have a value of some 4,500–5,000 euros or dollars. And it's the same price for other chrono-matic watches, be it Breitling or Heuer or what have you. Of course, all of those models using this movement all have the crown on the left side of the case instead of the right side. And if you're looking for one of these, then note that Hamilton did release, let's say, a remake of this watch. Limited edition, 1971 pieces to commemorate the 1971 model. But that remake uses a 7750 as a base, and this has the crown in the normal place. It also looks a little bit different, even though the case is very similar and the dial as well. But there are some differences, so make sure you look for the right one. Well, gotta say the price is also different. The remake is probably 1,000–2,000 euros max. So we got the cam in place together with the operating lever. We're going to put on the clutch next, and then also with the hour counter wheel that goes under the clutch. Now this is one of those springs I mentioned that's a little bit tricky to get on properly. And the clutch is then the part that moves, let's say, the power from the train onto the chronograph wheel or off it. And the way it does that is by connecting this oscillating pinion with the chronograph driving wheel underneath the plate here, and then into that little bearing on top. For the hour and minute counter wheels, we pretty much always have a jumper spring. And what that does is that it makes the wheel jump over. So instead of creeping, it jumps. Quite a few chronographs have creeping hours. Some also creeping minutes, but most of them jump. Now, I mentioned I made a mistake while assembling this, and this is the moment where I was like, hello? Because the hour counter wheel does not reset. So I had put the reset lever for the hour wheel on the wrong side of the cam. But here it is in the right place. And then we can put the rest of the stuff back together again. And then it should work. So I'm going to start the chronograph here. And then we're going to let it run for half an hour so that we can see that all those golden wheels flip over. Ooh, exciting! So here's that little finger on the underside of the chronograph wheel at the center of the movement, flipping one wheel over there, and then all the others as well. Fascinating. All right, let's turn the movement over, then we can put in place the calendar works. Now, as you've seen, there are two sides then to the movement. And the mainspring is on the other side. The mainspring drives the train of wheels, and then the power from the train of wheels is then transferred to this side of the movement. And on this side of movement, you have the motion works. So basically everything showing the time. So that will be the various pivots for putting hands on. In the center, of course, you have the hour hand and the minute hand, and also the pivot for the chronograph seconds hand. And as the motion works moves, as the hour hand, minute hand moves, of course, after 24 hours, there will be another little finger that flicks over that date disc. So yeah, watches are fascinating things. We're going to start by putting on the chronograph counter hands, the small ones. You might remember that one of the hands had come off its tube, but I simply pressed it back on and riveted it very slightly. Have to be careful so we don't remove the paint as well. But when hands are stuck like this, like that chronograph seconds hand and the hour counter hand, there isn't too much to do about these old watches. And the reason for that is that the hands are simply pressed onto the tube from the manufacturer. A lot of newer watches, the hand tubes will have a little base on the underside of the hand. And then you can use a different tool to grab that base and pull it up. But that would not work here. All right. With the hour and minute hands on, let's see if we can make the date flip over approximately at midnight. And that looks good. I'll say that dial is really beautiful. So we had this one problem that we didn't address yet. That the chronograph seconds hand does not reset at the same place every time. The reset action is performed by something called a hammer that hits a cam on the chronograph seconds wheel. And that hammer is simply not tight enough onto the cam. So with this screw here, or rather an eccentric, we can adjust the hammer a little bit so it fits snugglier to that cam. And then the seconds hand will reset to the same place every time. And now we can see there's tension on the hand. which means that the hammer is tight onto it. And yes, we have to take that chronograph seconds hand off again and put it back so it's nicely aligned, but I will do that off camera. For the case then, we're not going to do too much to it, and just refresh the finishing a little bit. So the case has vertical brushing on all sides and also on the face. So I'm using a finishing machine. First making sure that the case is flat against the side of the finishing belt. And when it is, we can tighten the 3D table here and then refinish the sides of the case. The issue with refinishing cases, with polishing them and so forth, is that you do remove metal. It is possible to add metal nowadays as well with laser machines. But in general, you remove metal every time you restore a case. So that's also why we want to be as gentle as possible. This case is old, so we're not gonna go too aggressively on it. There will be some marks on it still, but at least we're gonna make it look a little bit better. The case back has a couple of faceted slopes, and we can use the lapping machine to polish those as well. Use the same trick with some Sharpie to make sure that we have the flat against the disc before we start doing anything. And then for the flat center of the case back, we gently rub it against the lapping disc with a very high grit paper, so we don't take too much off. Of course, we want to make very sure we don't jeopardize any engravings or any logos or that type of thing. Now the case back also has some mirror polished areas, so I'm using the mops for that. And here's the thing, I was trying to find the best camera angle, and this looks really good, right? Perfect. Perfect for checking how much gray hair I have. So yeah, I'm gonna have to work on that camera angle, and we'll see the result of the polish later. I put the bezel insert back in the bezel. It just snaps in. And then we can put in this click. This is what gives the bezel a very firm clicking action when we use it. And here we have the retouched case. One of the main things that was an issue with the case was that the bevel between the face and the sides was completely, I don't know, polished over. So I did put a little shine on that one again as well. All right, that looks good, and good firm action. The pusher settings are screwed into the case, and there's a tool for that. We also put a little bit of Loctite on the threads so that it stays secure. And then we can put the springs back in, and also then the pushers themselves. Now my 6-year-old daughter had a really good question actually.
What watch are you making?
Yeah, my daughter is very sweet. She made a drawing for me today in school. And the drawing was of a watch, because she wanted to draw something she knows I like. And yeah, I like watches. So she knows I'm a watchmaker. And the logical question is then, what watch am I making? But that's the thing, watchmaker isn't really a watchmaker. Very few watchmakers nowadays. At some point, I hope I have something to show there, but that's going to be a long time before that happens. In the meantime, I'll do some watch repair and restoration. All right, we are then pretty much ready to case the movement. It is a very cool movement to look at, I must say. And also fun to work on. There aren't that many of these around nowadays, so yeah. Let's get the case clamps and the case screws in, and then we're going to start the chronograph and let it run for a while, and then reset it and see that everything works as it should. All right, let's start the chronograph, and then we're going to let it run while we put the case back on. And here we are, a long while later. Let's try to reset the chronograph and see that it works as it should. Yeah, that looks all right. Before seeing the watch on the wrist, I would like to remind everyone that at vintagewatchservices.eu you can always find 100 watches or more, beautiful vintage watches, fully serviced, and as a YouTube subscriber you get a 10% discount. There we are. Hamilton Pan-europ chrono-matic. Beautiful watch. Retouched the case just a little bit, and I think NATO strap looks really cool on that, complementing the blue dial. I hope you liked this video. If you did, then please consider clicking like and subscribe. That will really help the channel. We'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.